The Hegemony had been cataloging sentient life for precisely 4,732 standard cycles. Not that anyone was counting, except for the bureaucrats who insisted on tracking every tedious detail of their grand scientific endeavor. What had begun as a modest attempt to understand their galactic neighbors had evolved into something far more ambitious, a comprehensive ranking system that would definitively establish which species deserved to sit at the grown-ups table of cosmic civilization. The project's headquarters sprawled across 3 orbital platforms in the Nexus system, each facility humming with the self-important energy of academics who genuinely believed they were reshaping the universe, one classification at a time. Banks of quantum processors churned through terabytes of biological data, behavioral analyses and cultural assessments, all feeding into the grand taxonomy, a database so vast and complex that even its creators occasionally got lost trying to navigate it. At the top of their meticulously organized hierarchy sat the Vorthak, those insufferably proud crystalline beings, whose bodies could withstand the crushing depths of gas giants and whose minds processed information at speeds that made quantum computers look sluggish. Below them, the ethereals floated in their perpetual state of energy-based enlightenment, too transcendent to bother with mundane concerns like physical form or linear time. The Titan-class species occupied the third-tier massive, nearly indestructible beings who treated planetary collisions as minor inconveniences. Each classification came with exhaustive documentation. The researchers had identified exactly why the Shadowkin deserved their position as apex predators. Their ability to phase between dimensions made them nearly impossible to combat. The hive minds earned their ranking through perfect coordination across billions of individual units. The synthetics had transcended biological limitations entirely, upgrading themselves into mechanical perfection. Every species fit neatly into predetermined category. Apex predators, master strategists, evolutionary marvels, technological transcendence. The universe, it seemed, followed predictable patterns. Natural selection favored the strong, the fast, the clever, or the adaptable, and the Hegemony's scientists took considerable pride in having decoded these fundamental principles. Gentaxi, the project's lead xenobiologist, often remarked that their work had revealed the elegant mathematics underlying evolution itself. Species developed along logical trajectories, optimizing for survival advantages that could be measured, quantified, and ranked. It was beautiful in its simplicity, really, a cosmic order that made perfect sense once you had the proper framework to understand it. The research teams approached each new species with the confidence of mechanics, examining a familiar engine, physical capabilities, measured, cognitive processing speed, assessed, social structures, analyzed, technological advancement, documented, cultural complexity, filed under appropriate subsection. Every civilization they encountered slotted neatly into their expanding taxonomy, confirming their theories about evolutionary development. Until the day a junior researcher named Blim discovered a small blue planet in an unremarkable spiral arm galaxy. The initial surveys seemed routine enough. Third planet from a medium-sized star, adequate water supplies, oxygen-rich atmosphere, the usual recipe for carbon-based life. The dominant species appeared to be bipedal mammals with relatively standard primate characteristics. Preliminary scans revealed no obvious evolutionary advantages, no enhanced strength, no natural armor, no specialized sensory organs, no apparent longevity beyond the galactic average. Primitive tool users, Blim reported during the morning briefing, his tentacles waving dismissive. They've barely achieved interplanetary travel. Their technology is crude, their social structures chaotic. Honestly, I'm surprised they've managed to avoid extinction this long. The classification seemed straightforward. The species humans, according to their own linguistic designation, would probably slot somewhere in the middle lower tiers, perhaps above the purely instinct-driven creatures, but well below anything worthy of serious attention. They showed signs of rudimentary intelligence, and had developed basic metallurgy, but their political systems were a fragmented mess of competing nation-states. Their resource management was laughably inefficient, and their approach to conflict resolution involved pointing increasingly sophisticated weapons at each other. File them under emerging civilizations, subcategory, probable self-extinction. Gentaxi instructed without looking up from her more pressing research on the fascinating new cephalopods they'd discovered in the Andromeda spiral. But Blim found himself oddly intrigued by the humans' peculiarity. Their planet was a statistical anomaly, a world that should have been dominated by larger, stronger predators. Yet these relatively fragile mammals had somehow claimed the top spot. They had no claws, no fangs, no natural weapons to speak of. Their sensory capabilities were mediocre at best. They couldn't fly, they couldn't breathe underwater without assistance, and they died if exposed to temperatures that many species considered mildly uncomfortable. By every measurable standard, humans should have been prey animals, cowering in caves while more capable species ruled their world. Instead, they had somehow eliminated or domesticated nearly every other large predator on their planet. The math simply didn't add up. Blim submitted a request for extended observation protocols, knowing it would probably be denied. The taxonomy project had more important subjects to study, species that actually mattered in the grand scheme of galactic civilization. Humans were obviously just another mundane example of primitive tool use, destined to remain footnotes in the vast catalog of mediocrity. The approval came back within hours, stamped with Dr. Gentaxi's official seal and a note that read, "Granted. Complete the human assessment quickly so we can move on to more significant subjects." Neither Blim nor his supervisor had any idea they were about to discover that their elegant, mathematically perfect taxonomy had one rather significant flaw. It had been designed by species who had never encountered anything quite like a human being. 3 months into the Human Observation Project, Blim had developed what could charitably be described as a drinking problem. Not that anyone blamed him. The research team's weekly consumption of fermented algae extract had tripled since they began their in-depth study of humanity. The more data they collected, the less sense any of it made, and the Hegemony's finest xenobiologists were starting to question fundamental assumptions about evolution that had stood unchallenged for millennia. The physical assessment alone had been an exercise in cognitive dissonance. Humans possessed none of the obvious advantages that typically marked apex species. Their bones were brittle calcium composites that snapped under stress loads that wouldn't phase a juvenile crystal. Their skin offered no protection against environmental hazards. A single degree of temperature variation in either direction could kill them. Their muscle fibers generated pathetically low force-to-weight ratios compared to virtually every other species in their ecosystem. "Look at this," Blim announced during the daily briefing, his frustration evident as he projected holographic anatomical charts. "Their skeletal structure is designed for a creature that should weigh half as much and live in trees. Their digestive systems are so inefficient, they have to consume other organisms constantly just to maintain basic function. And don't get me started on their reproductive cycle. They produce one offspring at a time, with a gestation period so long that the females become practically defenseless for months." Dr. Gentaxi studied the data with growing bewilderment. By every metric their taxonomy used to evaluate species potential, humans were evolutionary dead ends. They were slow compared to their planet's predators, weak compared to their prey, and possessed sensory organs that barely functioned beyond their immediate environment. Their eyesight was mediocre, their hearing was worse, and their sense of smell was so atrophied that most species would classify them as functionally anosmic. "Perhaps they developed tool use as a compensation mechanism," suggested Dr. Wexit, the team's cultural anthropologist. "Many inferior species exhibit enhanced technological adaptation when faced with biological inadequacies. But even their technology defied logical analysis. Humans had somehow progressed from sharpened sticks to space travel in what amounted to a cosmic eye blink. Yet their advancement patterns were chaotic and unpredictable. They would master complex metallurgy, while simultaneously believing that burning certain plants would cure disease. They developed mathematical principles, sophisticated enough to predict planetary orbits, while maintaining social structures based on imaginary territorial divisions. The research team spent weeks trying to identify the evolutionary pressure that had driven human brain development. Large brains were metabolically expensive. They required enormous amounts of energy and left species vulnerable during extended developmental periods. Every other species had developed enhanced cognition for specific survival purposes: problem solving, social coordination, predator avoidance, or environmental adaptation. Humans appeared to have developed intelligence for its own sake, which violated several fundamental principles of natural selection. They waste cognitive resources on activities that provide no survival advantage, Dr. Gentaxi observed, reviewing behavioral analysis report. They create elaborate fictional narratives for entertainment. They manipulate their environment purely for aesthetic purposes. They even deliberately consume toxins that impair their cognitive function, apparently for recreational purposes. The social dynamics were equally baffling. Human groups exhibited cooperation levels that rivaled hive mind species, yet maintained individual autonomy that should have made such coordination impossible. They formed complex hierarchies, without the biological caste systems that typically supported organized society. Most inexplicably, they regularly risked their own survival to assist unrelated individuals, even members of entirely different species. Dr. Wexit had documented dozens of cases where humans had endangered themselves to rescue creatures that posed no benefit to their genetic lineage. They kept non-productive animals as companions, expending resources to maintain creatures that provided nothing more than emotional satisfaction. Some humans even refused to consume other animals entirely, deliberately adopting nutritionally challenging diets for philosophical reasons. It's as if they've developed empathy as a species-wide neurological disorder, Wexit reported. They anthropomorphize everything. They assign personalities to their vehicles. They mourn the destruction of inanimate objects. They form emotional attachments to abstract concepts. Their decision-making processes are compromised by considerations that have no rational basis. The team's behavioral psychologist, Dr. Finnick, had been studying human responses to threat scenarios. Most species exhibited predictable patterns: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. Humans displayed all of these responses, often simultaneously, but they also exhibited a fifth option that appeared nowhere else in the galactic taxonomy. When faced with superior force, humans would sometimes choose actions that guaranteed their own destruction, while maximizing damage to their opponents. They seemed to possess an innate understanding that victory could be achieved through making conquest more expensive than retreat. This scorched earth mentality had allowed them to defeat larger, stronger, and more technologically advanced enemies throughout their history. They're willing to lose in order to make winning not worth the cost. Finnick explained to his increasingly disturbed colleague, "It's strategically brilliant and evolutionarily insane. No other species would sacrifice certain genetic continuity for abstract principles like pride or spite." The researchers had been forced to create entirely new categories to document human behavioral patterns. Traditional classifications like aggressive, defensive, or cooperative proved inadequate when dealing with a species that could simultaneously exhibit all three responses to the same stimulus. Humans would fight to the death to protect strangers, while peacefully surrendering valuable resources to recognized enemies. They would cooperate extensively with competitors while maintaining lifelong grudges against allies. Most disturbing of all, humans seemed to thrive under conditions that should have triggered species-wide psychological collapse. They had survived ice ages, supervolcanic eruptions, and pandemic diseases that had eliminated other civilizations entirely. Rather than developing psychological adaptations to cope with existential threats, they appeared to have embraced uncertainty as a fundamental aspect of existence. "They've weaponized anxiety," Blim announced during what had become the team's daily crisis meeting. "Every other species either adapts to their environment or modifies it to suit their needs. Humans deliberately maintained themselves in a state of perpetual stress and used the resulting mental instability as a creative force." Gentaxi stared at the accumulated research data, trying to identify some pattern that would allow her to classify humanity according to established taxonomical principles. After 4 months of intensive study, she had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Humans weren't just anomalous. They represented a complete breakdown of everything the hegemony thought it understood about evolution, intelligence, and survival. "Request permission for direct contact protocols," she finally announced. "We need to study these creatures up close. The remote observations aren't providing sufficient data for proper classification." The approval arrived the following day, along with a stern reminder that the human assessment was already months behind schedule,
and that Dr. Gentaxi's team was expected to complete their work expeditiously. Neither the bureaucrats nor the research team had any idea that they were about to make first contact with a species that would fundamentally challenge the Hegemony's understanding of what it meant to be apex.
The Hegemony's first contact protocols had been refined over centuries of diplomatic encounters with hundreds of species. The procedure was elegantly simple: establish communication through mathematical principles, demonstrate technological superiority to gain respect, offer beneficial trade arrangements, and gradually introduce the subjects to galactic civilization. It had worked flawlessly with everyone from the warlike Bonecrusher clans to the paranoid hive minds of the Outer Rim. It took humans exactly 17 minutes to completely obliterate 4,000 years of diplomatic precedent. Gentaxi had chosen what their analysis indicated was a typical human research facility, a place where the species' most intelligent individuals gathered to expand their understanding of the universe. The location seemed perfect for initial contact. Isolated, populated by presumably rational thinkers, and equipped with the basic technology needed to facilitate communication. Their stealth approach had been textbook perfect. Their universal translator was functioning optimally, and their first contact team had rehearsed the encounter dozens of times. The problems began the moment they decloaked. Instead of the predicted responses, fear, awe, or curiosity, the humans reacted with what could only be described as aggressive enthusiasm. Rather than backing away from the obviously superior alien technology, they swarmed toward the landing craft with instruments, cameras, and an alarming number of questions delivered at machine gun pace. Within minutes, the carefully planned first contact had devolved into something resembling a very polite riot. "Fascinating bioluminescent patterns on your epidermis," announced one human, pressing uncomfortably close to Dr. Wexit while brandishing some kind of scanning device. "Are those chromatophores functional or purely decorative? Do they respond to emotional states? Can you control them consciously?" Before Wexit could formulate a response, another human had materialized with additional equipment. "The gravitational anomaly around your vessel suggests localized space-time manipulation. Are you using exotic matter for propulsion? How do you prevent paradox formation with closed time-like curves?" Gentaxi watched in growing horror as her carefully orchestrated first contact scenario collapsed into academic chaos. The humans weren't treating them as superior beings worthy of reverence. They were treating them as particularly interesting research subjects. Every attempt to establish proper diplomatic protocols was derailed by humans asking technical questions that wouldn't have occurred to most species until decades after initial contact. "Perhaps we should demonstrate our technological capabilities." Fennec, activating the standard display of force that typically impressed primitive civilizations, a precisely controlled energy beam that vaporized a nearby boulder. The humans applauded. "Coherent particle beam weapon," observed one of them, making notes on a primitive recording device. "Estimated energy output in the terawatt range. The focal precision suggests quantum-level targeting systems. I wonder if they're using contained antimatter or some kind of zero-point energy extraction." "Actually," interrupted another human, "the chromatic signature of the beam suggests they might be using weaponized dark energy. Look at the spectral analysis. Those wavelengths shouldn't exist in normal space-time." The research team found themselves being interrogated by creatures they had initially dismissed as barely sentient. Worse, many of the questions were embarrassingly sophisticated. Gentaxi had spent decades studying advanced propulsion systems. Yet these supposedly primitive humans were asking about theoretical applications she hadn't even considered. The situation deteriorated further when they attempted to explain the Hegemony's galactic classification system. The humans listened with polite attention until Dr. Gentaxi began describing their taxonomical methodology. "So you rank species based on measurable advantages," summarized one human researcher, whose name tag identified him as Professor Henderson. "Physical capabilities, cognitive processing speed, technological advancement, social complexity, a logical approach." "Indeed," Gentaxi replied, finally sensing some progress in the conversation. "Each species occupies its appropriate position based on objective criteria. And where exactly do humans rank in this system?" The research team exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had hoped to avoid this particular topic until they had established better rapport with the subjects. "Well," Gentaxi began diplomatically, Your species exhibits certain interesting characteristics that make classification somewhat challenging. Professor Henderson's eyebrows rose in what the team's behavioral analysis software identified as amusement, rather than offense. You mean we don't fit anywhere in your system? That's not entirely. Let me guess. Another human interrupted, grinning in a manner that their threat assessment protocols couldn't quite categorize. We're not strong enough to be apex predators, not smart enough to be master strategists, not advanced enough to be technological transcendents, and not coordinated enough to be hive minds. We're probably somewhere in the middle lower tiers, filed under probable self-extinction. The accuracy of this assessment was deeply unsettling. Dr. Gentaxi had spent months studying human behavioral patterns, yet they seemed to understand her research conclusions better than she did. However, the human continued, his grin widening. I suspect you're discovering that your classification system has a rather significant blind spot. Before anyone could ask what he meant, alarms began blaring throughout the research facility. The humans immediately abandoned their academic discussions and transformed into something the Hegemony's behavioral models hadn't predicted. A coordinated response team operating with military precision. Seismic event. Magnitude 7.2, announced someone over the facility's communication system. Epicenter 15 kilometers northwest. Tsunami warning in effect for all coastal regions. The alien research team prepared to evacuate, as any rational species would when faced with a major natural disaster. The humans, however, began moving toward the danger. The Nakamura Deep Sea Research Station has 37 people, Professor Henderson explained while rapidly gathering equipment. The evacuation protocols will get most of them out, but their submersibles won't reach minimum safe depth in time. Surely you're not planning to attempt a rescue, Dr. Fennick protested. The statistical probability of success is negligible, and the risk to your own survival is enormous. Henderson paused in his equipment gathering to stare at the alien research. 37 people, he repeated, as if this explained everything. But the logical response would be to minimize losses by ensuring your own survival, Wexeth pointed out. Those individuals are already statistically doomed. The look Henderson gave them contained more condescension than the Hegemony's most arrogant nobles had ever managed. You really don't understand humans at all, do you? Within minutes, the research facility had transformed into a disaster response center. Humans who had been engaged in abstract theoretical research moments before were now coordinating rescue operations, improvising solutions to impossible problems, and volunteering for missions that their own analysis computers rated as suicidal. Gentaxi watched in fascination and growing dread as her subjects systematically violated every principle of rational survival behavior. They split into teams that maximized coverage rather than safety. They shared critical equipment with competitors rather than hoarding resources. Most incomprehensibly, they assigned their most valuable researchers to the most dangerous positions. This is madness, Dr. Wexeth observed, as humans loaded experimental deep-sea vehicles with equipment that hadn't been properly tested. They're risking their entire research program for individuals who are already beyond help. Professor Henderson overheard the comment, while performing final systems checks on what appeared to be a hastily modified submersible. Maybe, he acknowledged cheerfully, but if we don't try, we'll never know if it was possible. The rescue operation that followed defied every prediction the Hegemony's computers could generate. Humans accomplished impossible tasks, through sheer bloody-minded determination, improvised solutions to problems that should have taken years to solve, and somehow managed to save 34 of the 37 trapped researchers, using equipment that shouldn't have functioned and tactics that violated several laws of physics. When it was over, the alien research team found themselves staring at a species that had just demonstrated capabilities that didn't appear anywhere in their taxonomy. Humans weren't stronger, faster, or smarter than other apex species. They were something far more dangerous. They were unpredictable. Dr. Gentaxi realized with growing horror that they hadn't been studying a primitive species that might someday become a minor galactic power. They had been casually observing creatures who treated impossible odds as interesting challenges and natural disasters as opportunities for creative problem-solving. Request immediate consultation with Hegemony Command,
she announced to her shell-shocked research team. We may have significantly underestimated the classification requirements for this species. The emergency session of the Hegemony's Taxonomical Council convened in the sterile conference chambers of Nexus Prime, where the galaxy's most distinguished xenobiologists gathered to address what had officially been termed the human problem. Gentaxi's report had circulated through the scientific community like a virus, leaving seasoned researchers questioning fundamental assumptions about evolution, intelligence, and the very nature of apex species. 18 months had passed since first contact, and the situation had only grown more complicated. What began as a routine classification exercise had evolved into something resembling a galactic crisis of confidence. The humans hadn't just disrupted the Hegemony's carefully organized taxonomy. They had somehow managed to disrupt the entire galactic order without appearing to notice they were doing it. The trade negotiations alone have been a disaster, reported Ambassador Teclan, whose species had successfully conducted commerce with over 300 civilizations. Humans don't follow any recognizable economic principle. They'll spend enormous resources on projects with no measurable benefit, then refuse profitable arrangements because they don't feel right about the terms. The assembly murmured in sympathetic frustration. Several delegates had attempted to establish standard resource exchange protocols with Earth's various nation-states, only to discover that humans approached negotiations like performance art, rather than rational economic planning. They would reject obviously beneficial deals based on ethical considerations that weren't quantifiable, then accept disadvantageous arrangements because they found their negotiating partners interested. They've disrupted 17 established trade routes, Teclan continued, not through military force or economic manipulation, but by offering alternatives that make no sense from a profit maximization standpoint. They're giving away advanced medical technology in exchange for cultural artifacts. They're providing disaster relief to species they've never encountered before. Half the Outer Rim civilizations have abandoned traditional commercial relationships because humans keep demonstrating that mutual benefit doesn't require exploitation. Vorthani, representing the crystalline apex species that had dominated galactic politics for millennia, rose from her position at the head of the council table. Her bioluminescent patterns flickered with what her species expressed as profound irritation. The humans have been invited to observe 17 different apex-level civilizations, she announced, her harmonic voice resonating through the chamber's acoustic systems. In every case, they have asked questions that revealed fundamental flaws in our social structures, technological applications, or philosophical framework. They don't appear to be deliberately undermining our authority. They're simply curious about everything, and their curiosity is apparently toxic to established hierarchy. The ethereal's representative, existing as a shimmering energy pattern in a containment field, pulsed with colors that translated roughly to existential anxiety. They attended one of our transcendence ceremonies, it reported through the universal translator. We expected them to be awed by our liberation from physical form. Instead, they asked why we were so eager to abandon sensory experience when we hadn't fully explored the possibilities of embodied consciousness. 3 of our most advanced practitioners have since requested rematerialization procedures that we haven't needed for centuries. Similar reports poured in from across the galactic community. The hive minds complained that humans kept asking individual drones about personal opinions, somehow triggering what could only be described as an outbreak of independent thinking. The Titan-class species found themselves questioning the value of physical invulnerability after humans demonstrated that fragility could be transformed into adaptability. The synthetics were experiencing unprecedented system crashes as they attempted to process human behavior patterns that violated their logical frameworks. They're not trying to conquer us, Dr. Gentaxi explained to the increasingly agitated assembly. That would be comprehensible. They're accidentally making us conquer ourselves by asking questions we never thought to ask, and solving problems in ways that reveal how limited our own approaches have been. The most disturbing reports came from species that had attempted to study human civilization more extensively. The archivists, whose perfect memory storage had preserved the complete history of galactic development, found themselves struggling to document human activities that seemed to change meaning based on context, motivation, and temporal perspective. Events that appeared catastrophic in the short term often proved beneficial over longer periods, while actions that seemed obviously beneficial frequently produced unexpected negative consequences. Linear causality appears to be optional for humans, reported Chief Archivist Dulgrim, his multiple eyes blinking in distressed sequence. They operate according to principles that exist outside our standard models of cause and effect. Their historical development includes numerous instances where they achieved success by doing exactly the opposite of what rational analysis would suggest. Dr. Fennick presented the psychological assessment data that had taken his team 8 months to compile. The results were simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. Humans exhibited cognitive flexibility that bordered on mental instability, emotional responses that defied logical categorization, and decision-making processes that somehow produced effective results despite violating every principle of rational choice theory. They've developed what can only be described as weaponized irrationality, Fennick announced. When confronted with impossible situations, they don't recalculate their approach based on realistic assessments. They redefine what constitutes possibility. They treat failure as a temporary inconvenience, rather than a final outcome. Most disturbingly, this approach actually works for them. The council chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. For millennia, the Hegemony's classification system had been built on the assumption that evolution rewarded optimization, that successful species developed increasingly refined approaches to survival, efficiency, and resource management. Humans had achieved dominance on their planet, and were rapidly expanding into space using strategies that were demonstrably suboptimal by every measurable standard. Their chaos agents, Vortheni finally announced, her bioluminescent patterns, shifting to colors that indicated reluctant respect, mixed with existential dread. They don't just refuse to follow established patterns, they're incapable of following established patterns. They introduce variables into stable systems that we never accounted for because we never imagined they could exist. The debate that followed lasted for 6 standard days. Proposals ranged from quarantining the human system, to prevent further contamination of galactic civilization, to attempting military intervention before humans could spread their destabilizing influence further. Several delegates suggested simply reclassifying humans as a natural disaster, rather than a sentient species. In the end, they settled on something far more radical: complete revision of the Hegemony's taxonomical framework. The new classification system included an entirely unprecedented category: apex chaos species. Humans were designated as the sole occupant of this classification, with a warning label that had never been required for any other sentient life form. Approach with extreme caution. Standard predictive models do not apply. The official description, written by Dr. Taxi after months of careful consideration, read: humans represent a fundamental challenge to conventional understanding of evolutionary optimization. While lacking obvious physical or cognitive advantages relative to other apex species, they have achieved dominance through strategic unpredictability, tactical irrationality, and systematic exploitation of variables that other species either cannot perceive or choose not to engage with. They appear to have evolved specifically to violate natural laws that other species evolved to follow. The classification came with unprecedented restrictions. Contact with humans required advance approval from the Hegemony's highest level. Trade negotiations needed supervision from specialists trained in chaos theory. Military encounters were classified as asymmetric by default, with standard tactical doctrines suspended for any engagement involving human forces. Most significant, the new taxonomy included a warning that would have been unthinkable when the project began 4,000 years earlier. Prolonged exposure to human behavioral patterns may result in fundamental alteration of observer species, psychological, social, and technological development. Contact protocols should account for the possibility that humans may not be the subjects of study, but rather the active agents of transformation. As the council session concluded and delegates prepared to return to their respective civilizations, Gentaxi found herself contemplating the elegant irony of their situation. The Hegemony had spent millennia cataloging species according to their measurable advantages, creating a hierarchy based on objective superiority and rational optimization. Humans had taught them that the most dangerous predators weren't necessarily the strongest, fastest, or smartest. Sometimes the apex species was simply the one that refused to accept that anything was impossible, and somehow made that refusal work. The galaxy would never be quite the same. But then again, that was probably exactly what humans had intended all along, whether they realized it or not.